Hello everyone, it's James here for another Biome Bites episode. In these episodes, it's just me talking, and we speak about specific topics that have come up frequently on the Inside Matters podcast with a view to giving you more digestible, excuse the pun, information that you can take into your daily lives to improve your gut health and your microbiome. So in today's episode, we're going to be speaking about what not to eat for your microbiome. We spoke on a previous episode about the 3 Ps, polyphenols, prebiotics and probiotics, and why they're good for your microbiome. Today we're going to be speaking about things that are not good for your microbiome. But before we jump into that, let's take a step back. So as a reminder for those who've been listening to the podcast for a while, or as new information for those that have just tuned in, the microbiome is a term used to describe all the microorganisms that inhabit a particular environment, their collective genomic potential, so all of their genes, and their theatre of functional activity, essentially all the things that they produce. Now, there's microbiomes everywhere. There's a microbiome in your toilet. There's a microbiome in your ear. There's a microbiome in your gut, which is what we're speaking about today. But there's also microbiomes in soil, which are really important for plant health. There's microbiomes in the sea, microbiomes in coral reefs. Basically, there's microbiomes everywhere. And there's a lot of learnings that we can take actually from microbiomes in different parts of the world to create analogies and ideas and concepts that can be applied to our gut microbiome. So just one example, you can think about weeds in your garden. If the conditions promote the growth of weeds, they become dominant, and all the other life forms within the garden in the context of plants typically die off. So what we're trying to do with our gut microbiome is make sure that we've got very low levels of weeds. How do we do that? We create a healthy ecosystem within the gut who protect us and resist the colonization of bad bugs, which are analogous to weeds. And we make sure that we don't consume things that damage our microbiome. And today we're going to be speaking about what not to eat and what not to drink and what not to do to promote a healthy, beneficial microbiome. So what we're going to start with is diet, because diet's everything in the context of the microbiome. If you're not taking steps every day to look after your microbiome, then you're not doing everything you can to be as healthy as you possibly can. We all take a daily multivitamin, not all of us take a daily multivitamin. A lot of people take a daily multivitamin. But do we give our microbiome a daily multivitamin? No, we should. We should spend every day giving the microorganisms that inhabit our body foodstuffs and supplements to eat, and not essentially damaging them or promoting the growth of the weeds through bad foods. So first things first, avoid anything that's been processed if you can. So a good way to think about this is, if it's already been processed, then there's nothing for the microbiome to process. The microbiome just consumes it and doesn't produce the beneficial things that we want it to produce, or it has a damaging effect on the microbiome due to the nature of the foodstuffs. So essentially, if something has been created by man, then it's likely not to be good. Whereas if something has been created by the planet, you could be more spiritual, or if you're religious, think about God, think about the creator, then it's likely to be good. So things that are minimally processed, nuts, fruits, plants, meats that haven't been processed, olive oil, which has been kind of squeezed and pressed rather than manufactured through some extremely significant industrial process and have had hydrogen and things like that added to it. So the key take home is minimally processed as much as you possibly can. And the minimally processed food not only nourishes your microbiome, but almost always has a higher micronutrient content and is almost always more satiating, so it makes you feel more full, and probably has a better macronutrient content, the macronutrients being fat, carbohydrate, protein. So there's a whole raft of benefits from eating a minimally processed diet. And a lot of people who have gut problems, who transition from a diet that's heavily processed to a diet that's minimally processed, see their symptoms go away, particularly in the context of irritable bowel syndrome. And this comes back to this broader picture of reducing the number of bad microorganisms in your gut, replacing or reinstating the microorganisms that were once there, or enhancing the microbiome through new microorganisms, and then nourishing. And the great thing about a healthy, minimally processed, diverse diet is that you're doing all of those things, because you've got some prebiotics in there, which are non-digestible, complicated carbohydrates, fibers, which promote the beneficial growth of bacteria. You've got probiotic-containing foods, miso, kefir, kimchi, kombucha, sauerkraut, as a non-exhaustive list. And in addition to that, you've also got these things called polyphenols, which are metabolites from plants, which both have beneficial properties for our own cells, but also have beneficial effects for the microbiome. So think about 3 Ps in the context of what you're eating. Another thing I would recommend avoiding is artificial sweeteners. So this is a seriously controversial subject. On the one hand, some people say things like you should avoid sugar in your drinks and you should replace those with artificial sweeteners. They're safe. There's been lots of research studies that have been conducted to prove that they're safe. And actually, it's impossible to have a toxic dose of things like aspartame, because if you were to drink enough of the drinks that contain aspartame to actually get to the level in your blood of when it starts to become toxic, you will have died from essentially overhydration. The medical term would be dilutional hyponatremia. However, that's not the whole story. And what we haven't done until relatively recently is study the impact of artificial sweeteners on the microbiome. And there's been a lot of interesting research published in recent times showing that artificial sweeteners, things like aspartame, absolutely do have an impact on the microbiome. And it's almost certainly a negative impact for most people. Now, not all sweeteners are bad. One of the sweeteners that did quite well in the study that I'm specifically talking about, which we can link in the post-show notes, was something called stevia, which is a sweetener that's found from plant leaves. And that didn't have as negative an impact on the microbiome in the patients and volunteers who were studied as part of that study. Now, one of the challenges with stevia is that most of your readily accessible off-the-shelf drinks that we like to drink don't contain stevia, they contain aspartame. So really, you need to make a lifestyle choice. And the lifestyle choice is, do I want to consume any of these carbonated beverages at all? I know they're ingrained and entrenched into our daily lives. I stopped drinking them probably about 6 months ago, and at the company I work at, Introbiotics, a number of the other members of staff have stopped drinking them altogether as well, and I've replaced them with quote-unquote natural alternatives, and sometimes even make their own kombucha instead. So that's artificial sweeteners. The other thing I want to talk about is alcohol. So again, alcohol has a controversial status in the health and well-being, longevity, medical community. So on the one hand, some studies suggest that having a little bit of alcohol, certainly within the recommended daily allowance and recommended weekly allowance, is beneficial for your health. Other studies suggest that no alcohol at all is better than even a tiny drop of alcohol. So what does this mean and what do we take away? Well, that debate is probably better had on a different form of podcast. What I will say, though, very clearly, is that when you alcohol gel your hands, the reason you're alcohol gelling your hands is because you're trying to kill bacteria. So if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, then you're absolutely going to have an impact on your microorganisms, who either die or turn into spores, which are kind of dormant forms of the microorganism, when they come into contact with alcohol. So my recommendation is to reduce your alcohol intake, kind of as low as possible, without it impacting on other aspects of your life, which may be life enhancing and longevity promoting, like socializing, for example. Red wine has come up a few times. Red wine does contain a lot of polyphenols. It doesn't contain fiber, but it contains polyphenols, in particular polyphenol called resveratrol, which has been shown in a number of animal studies to have positive effects on a whole raft of bodily functions and systems, and actually makes rodents live longer. Now, that hasn't yet translated into robust human studies. Some people really recommend it and have been taking it for a long time as a supplement. And to get the level that I think you really require for it to have a life-enhancing effect, you kind of need to take a supplement, because otherwise you'll be drinking a heck of a lot of red wine. That said, there has been some studies which have shown that red wine drinkers have a higher diversity of microbiome than non-red wine drinkers. And this was a study conducted by some French researchers. So essentially, you have to make your own choice. I think a glass or two of red wine a week is likely to have less negative impact than consuming, an equivalent amount of purified spirits or things like that. So I think a couple of glasses of red wine is what's recommended by some US doctors now who are focused on functional medicine and the microbiome. But I think alcohol to excess has an extremely damaging effect on the microbiome. And antibiotics, we're very interested in something called the gut-liver connection, the gut-liver axis. 70% of the blood that goes to the liver comes from the gut, and high amounts of alcohol absolutely have a damaging effect on the lining that essentially contains the microorganisms in your intestinal tract from spilling out into the rest of the body. And if that gets damaged, then you see translocation, movement of microorganisms and products of their metabolism into the bloodstream, triggering the immune system and moving their way into the liver, having a damaging effect. So I think that in liver cirrhosis, for example, which is scarring of the liver, the alcohol is having a negative impact on the microbiome, and that's having a negative impact on the gut lining, and it's triggering immune system activation, which is causing the scarring of the liver. So excessive amounts of alcohol is absolutely going to have an impact on your microbiome. And a lot of people do have gastric discomfort, gastric distress, so essentially changes to their intestinal tract activity after a big night of drinking. So that's because alcohol is an irritant, it's a toxin, it's not good for your gut, and it's not good for your microbiome. Also going to talk about smoking. Smoking absolutely has an impact on your gut microbiome. It has a even bigger impact, relatively speaking, on your lung microbiome, and that should come as no surprise to anybody. The lung has a microbiome, it's very important. And the reasons you get infections are because the microbiome within your lung changes. So smoking has an impact. Smokers have less diversity within their intestinal tract than those who don't smoke. A lot of people have shifted from smoking to vaping now. I think there's less research on the impact of vaping on the gut microbiome. It probably has an impact. And same's to be said for cannabis, in addition to just regular tobacco. So the advice there would be to reduce smoking as much as possible. Ideally stop. I'm not sure there are any health benefits to smoking other than potentially being protective in some forms of inflammatory bowel disease, which is something that we just don't understand. It could be because of what it does to the microbiome. If you want to learn more about that, you should listen to episode number 1 of Inside Matters, where we spoke to Dr. Richard Hansen, who's an expert in inflammatory bowel disease. So we've talked about what not to eat and what not to do. We could go a step further and talk about antibiotics, but they're not really readily accessible to us. The advice there would be to not take antibiotics unless you really need them as prescribed by a doctor. Okay, so just to recap then, we've spoken about processed foods, processed sugars, processed oils. We've talked about the importance of minimally processed, things that can occur naturally on the earth, real food, as it's sometimes called, versus things that have been produced through an industrial process where they strip out the fibre, strip out the micronutrients, strip out the colour, all the things which are indicators of something that might be good for your microbiome. We've spoken about artificial sweeteners, we've spoken about alcohol, we've spoken about smoking. Now the kind of interesting thing is, all of that really can be attributed to general health as well. So maybe we need to think about, well, all these general health recommendations, they're linked to the microbiome, so maybe the microbiome was just integral for our general health. All of these government guidelines, they all have an impact on the microbiome. So health guidelines are microbiome guidelines too. Hope you've enjoyed the episode. As always, if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out on email or on social media. Look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.